Hello, and welcome to the Nintendo Power Retrospectives. I'm Count Zero, and this week we'll be doing the first of 3 episodes where I'll be looking at the best of the rest of the titles on the Nintendo Power Top 30 for the magazine's first year. Specifically, I'm looking at titles that made the Top 30 list, but were not themselves featured in the magazine, which means, thus, I didn't review them when the issues first came out. So I'm kind of going for completion here. There are 33 titles that made this list, and, well, since that's basically divides up into 2 prime numbers, 3 and 11, to keep this going at a reasonable rate, I'm going to go through these 11 at a time, which means I get done with this in 3 episodes. And I presume by the 3rd episode of this, I'll probably finally understand what Dr. Sparkle goes through when he's putting together an episode of Crontendo. What's that you say? You don't know who Dr. Sparkle is? Or what's a Crontendo? Well then, I will put a link in the doobly-doo to tell you what a Crontendo is. And so you can enjoy a show that is just as good, if not better than mine. So, still, I've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. Number 33, Ring King. Ring King is an interesting boxing game for the NES. I definitely call it inferior to Punch-Out, though, in quite a few respects. While in Punch-Out, opposing boxers had obviously telegraphed tells that would let you know when they were going to attack, you were able to read their body language to respond to their actions, which is something that a real boxer would theoretically be able to do. In Ring King, while it gives you more of a view of the boxing ring and more of an opportunity to move around it, you can't do that. You can't read body language because of how small the sprites are, thus blocking and dodging attacks becomes rather difficult. That said, the ability to move around the ring gives the game a whole new level of strategy that most boxing games, or at least that Punch-Out at least, doesn't have. Because, well, in Punch-Out, positioning in the ring and movement, aside from like dodging and weaving from side to side, has very little to do with success. Whereas on the other hand, in real boxing, movement and footwork is very much an important part of success. That's why, among other things, one of the training methods that you often see boxers do in movies and so forth, or just in general, is jump rope, because it involves basically building up your timing with your feet and improving your footwork. Now, I do give Ring King some serious props for trying to replicate that, but because of the technical limitations of the NES, we run into the problems I mentioned earlier, that the sprites become too small, that you don't have the ability to use the other important skill that most boxers have, which is the ability to read your opponent's body language and anticipate their actions to block punches or dodge punches and take advantage of openings. Now again, this isn't a terrible game. The game also has something of a skill system where, as you win matches, you gain skill points to spend on 3 slots: speed, punch strength, and stamina, but you don't get skill points if you lose matches, so you can't grind into your skill levels in the game compensate for your performance, so it's kind of a wash. Also, the game has a password system for the career mode, which is kind of a nice touch. I do like it when games do that. Number 32, Section Z. Section Z is the first jetpack shoot-'em-up I reviewed thus far. I distinguish the jetpack variety of this genre from other parts because, while in most shoot-'em-up games you fly a spaceship or a giant robot, and they're mainly distinguished based on how they scroll, either side-scrolling, like with Gradius, or top-down, like with the 1942 games, or 1940X games. The jetpack games distinguish themselves by type of character. Specifically, you are a guy in a jetpack, or again a giant robot, and as a consequence, your hitbox, the part of you where you can get shot, tends to be kind of bigger, particularly in older games. In more recent games, technology has gotten such where they can give you a bigger sprite but a tiny hitbox, and thus make this stuff work slightly better, but still. With these older games, on jetpack shoot 'em ups, you were easier to hit. And also, generally they contended with characters coming from both sides of the screen, not just in front, but also from behind, with exceptions for kinds of games where, due to how the camera angle worked, you couldn't have enemies coming from behind, like, for example, Space Harrier, where it's a jetpack shoot 'em up, you're a character wearing a jetpack with a fairly large sprite, but since your camera angle is from behind, everything is coming at you from in front, nothing can sneak up on you. So with this game, you play a character having to navigate through a enemy space fortress, starting from the outside of the base and making your way deeper using teleporters. This is actually a significant difference from the original arcade version of Section Z, as the home version is significantly less linear. In the arcade version, you start from Section A, you make your way to Section Z, hence the title of the game. In the home version, because of the teleporters, you can skip ahead through the level by several parts, or you could skip back by several parts, depending on which teleporters you pick. And at the end of each stage or section, you then get a boss fight. So consequently, instead of having just 26 levels, like with the arcade version of the game, you actually have 60, though you can beat the game without having to play through every level. The game also changes from having the character killed in one hit, like in the arcade version, to using an energy meter to track the amount of health you have in the game. Getting hit by bullets lowers your energy meter by 1, while making contact with enemies basically gets you instantly killed, and drops your energy meter by 5, and sending you back to the start of the level. Once your energy meter hits 0, you get a game over and have to start over again from the last stage that you completed. Unfortunately, the US version of the game is missing one feature that the Japanese version of the game had, which I think is fairly significant. It had a save option, as the Japanese version was released for the Famicom Disk System. Here, there's a continue option, but there is no way to pick up where you left off if you have to turn the system off for any reason. You have to go to work, power outage, whatever. So, consequently, it's slightly inferior from the Famicom Disk System version. Also, from a power and processing standpoint, the game unfortunately basically bites off more than it can chew. On more than a few occasions, the game puts more bullets and enemies on screen than the NES can handle, causing the game to get some serious flicker problems. I suspect this might be a relic of this being the Famicom Disk System version of the game, as even if the cartridge version of the game added additional memory chips, I don't know if they could have necessarily adjusted the game to reflect that without having to mess with the code to address the additional memory. So I'm not sure if fixing this would have been feasible for Capcom. Still, I had fun with this game, and I definitely put this in the running for this episode's pick. Number 31, Mario Brothers. The original Mario Brothers is one of those games which was great in the arcades and might work really well now in the age of online leaderboards and achievements. However, in the age of the NES, it doesn't quite work as well as a home game. You play as Mario or Luigi, and you try to get the highest score possible by defeating critters in the sewers. You defeat them by bonking the ground underneath them with your head and fist, and once they've flipped over, you go up to their level and walk into them to get your points. That's it. The game just keeps going from there until you die or hit a kill screen. Consequently, if you're playing the game solo, it's not particularly engrossing. I'd recommend skipping the game unless you anticipate having a bunch of people to play it against. Number 30, Side Pocket. When it comes to genres of game that I feel can really show what a console this era can do, one of the ones that I think really excels at this is the pool simulator. Not only does this genre of game have to handle moving pool balls on screen, but also has to calculate the movement of each pool ball in the game with realistic physics to reflect how the surface of the table would cause the ball to slow down and how the transference of momentum from one ball to another would affect their movement. So really, this is like one of those things where if you want to really showcase what your system can do, it's either this or a shoot 'em up. And honestly, Side Pocket is a really good, really fun pool sim. The game does a really good job of giving a good feel of where you're aiming the ball, and while the power meter takes a little bit of getting accustomed to, it's honestly kind of the same thing with pool as well. It takes a bit to figure out exactly how much force you need to put on the cue to get the speed that you want when you're learning to play pool for the first time. And the advantage here, though, is if you mess up, you don't have to worry about messing up the felt and having to pay to have the table resurfaced, which is expensive. Also, the game has a 2-player mode, so you can go out and play pool with your friends without having to either shell out for an expensive table for your house or apartment, which, again, you will probably need to have refelted at some point, or have to go out someplace and spend money to pay pool at, I don't know, some pool hall with a coin-operated pool table or whatever that expects you to buy drinks. Something. Anyway, this game is awesome. Number 29. Ghosts and Goblins. Ghosts and Goblins is a game that is considerably more difficult than it has any right being, in part due to the fact that this is a home port of an arcade game that was designed to eat your quarters like Pac-Man eats pellets. This isn't helped by the fact that the 8-bit sprites of this game just aren't as detailed as the arcade version of this game, or that the 16-bit version of the game which came out later, in addition to looking better, also play better, and have a lot more character and flair to them. Consequently, I actually enjoy the 16-bit versions of this game and the arcade version considerably more than this one, and I'd recommend picking up one of those over this one. Number 28. Spy Hunter. Spy Hunter is another game which would probably fare better in the form of a modern console port with achievements and leaderboards. The original arcade version, along with the SNES version, are chase the high score style of game with no real win state aside from beating the highest score. That said, it's incredibly fun to play, and I'm kind of surprised we haven't gotten some sort of Midway arcade compilation like the ones that Capcom is doing right now on PSN and Xbox Live Arcade, with this game being part of that similar collection. Number 27. Rush and Attack by Konami. So what do you get when you cross Irem's Kung Fu, which will be showing up later this episode, with a bad 1980s Chuck Norris commando film? You get Rush and Attack. You run through a bunch of generic-looking military bases, stab dudes with your one attack, which is performed by pressing B, and jump over landmines. Occasionally, you'll fight enemies who will shoot at you, or you'll get a gun that will have about 3 shots. Oh, and jumping? The jump button isn't mapped to A. You know, like every other NES game later. You know, A jumps, B shoots. No, it's mapped to the up button. Who the hell thought that was a good idea? Anyway, the game isn't particularly good or imaginative. If you want an NES game that will capitalize on your nostalgia for 80s action films, I'd recommend Contra instead. It plays better and has action which fits more with the idiom of Arnold, Stallone, or Reb Brown firing a machine gun from the hip while screaming. Number 26. Pinball. Pinball is a competent but rather bland pinball game. The game only has one table, with the options giving choices for the player between ball speed and whether you're doing 2-player or a 1-player game. There isn't really anything particularly special about this game. There are no opportunities for skill shots, nor is there a multi-ball. I will say, though, the game's controls are very good, with the face buttons being used for the right flipper and the left flipper being controlled by using the D-pad, which is very intuitive. Props for that. Number 25. Zanac. Zanac is a hell of a game. It's a shoot-'em-up by compile, with all that entails. The action is fast and furious, and the game throws a lot of stuff on screen at once, and it handles it very well, generally. The controls are responsive, and the power-up selection is interesting. Hell, the game even has unlimited continues, something that couldn't really be said for a lot of other home console shooters. This is probably helped by the fact that the game was developed for consoles and home computers first, instead of for arcades. This means the game was being designed from the ground up by people who know that they're working with a system that doesn't have a quarter slot. Also, the game has a bit of a feature to it which doesn't really show well in this gameplay video, but it's basically kind of like what would later be known as the AI director for like the Left 4 Dead games and similar games. Essentially, depending on how you perform in this game, whether you beat bosses in the time limit and how many bullets you shoot and that sort of thing, that determines how difficult or how easy the game will be, and the game calculates all this on the fly. It's a very imaginative system that's definitely kind of ahead of its time, as I don't recall any other system using something quite like this until the AI Director. The closest thing that comes to mind in my head is how Max Payne handled the spawning and positioning of ammunition in game levels based on the guns you're using and your health level. So, anyway, this game is definitely worth checking out. Number 24, Kung Fu. I gotta say I'm not a fan of this game. The controls are a little rough and the level design is bland. You walk from one direction to the other, you punch everything in your way, and the only variety is in the types of enemies. Not in backgrounds or anything else like that, not even music. If Russian Attack had used the proper A jumps and B shoots controls, I would consider it a better game than Kung Fu is, frankly. Because at least Russian Attack has different music and different level backgrounds. As it is, both games are equally bland. Number 23, Baseball. This game is really disappointing, especially after having played Bases Loaded. The batting portion of the game is fair enough, at least in terms of how well you can swing with this camera angle. However, fielding in this game is absolutely abysmal. Outfielders run like they're ankle-deep in mud while wearing combat boots, and the delay between picking up the ball and throwing it is absurd. This game is absolutely abysmal. Skip it. Well, that's 11 down, 22 to go. We have some two-player and single-player titles this week, which means I go back to my two picks. Where my single-player pick, it was a tough decision here, but I'm going with Zanac. I like shoot-'em-ups, and Zanac is a game which really kind of caught my interest in terms of the style of shoot-'em-up. It's one that's designed first for the console, as I mentioned in the review, and it really benefits from that. It shows that when you're making a shoot-'em-up game, that keeping your platform in mind makes all the difference when it comes to the quality of the end product. For my two-player game, I'm going with Side Pocket, because honestly, it's a really good pool game. I would call it the best pool game ever, and it's certainly no substitute for the real thing. But, honestly, if you don't have room for a pool table of your own, your workplace doesn't have a pool table, and you don't have some place nearby where you feel like going to play pool that isn't, like, I don't know, frequented by bikers or something, there's really nothing particularly better I can think of aside from, at least in terms of the games, this issue. It is a very, very solid pool game. Definitely worth checking out. So we'll continue from there next time, and in our next episode we will have more titles from Konami, as well as a NES port of an arcade classic from Namco. I hope you look forward to that, and I'll see you then. If you enjoyed this episode, please click like or thumbs up on YouTube, and subscribe to my channel so you get more updates for whenever my next episodes come out, and so forth and so on. So, catch you later.